So this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing with volume 2 of Individuation on the text History of the Notion of the Individual. Last time we read I think we started with the Pascal section. For Pascal, or for Simondon, what's interesting about Pascal is I guess the opposition with Descartes, in the sense that for Descartes, there's a kind of how do I put this? The individual for Descartes is a kind of epistemological individual. So there's this project of reconstructing knowledge on the basis of individual reason. The individual has to sort of undergo the experience of putting knowledge into doubt and then reaching the indubitable knowledge of the cogito and then founding the rest of knowledge on that basis. Whereas for Pascal, the individual is something that is not sort of given all at once at the beginning of the problem, as it is for Descartes. So it's not that we have this sort of immediate, indubitable knowledge of our existence. We instead have to sort of work through a problem to come to have knowledge of ourselves. And in particular, we have to make choices that are not sort of intellectual choices. So, like the famous example, of course, is Pascal's wager, which is the argument that, or the sort of argument that Pascal gives to say why we should believe in God, because if God doesn't exist, then we are just sort of wasting our time and not really harming anything. But if God does exist and we don't believe in Him, then we're condemning ourselves to eternal suffering. So we can the sort of trade-off is either a sort of waste of time on the one hand or eternal suffering on the other. And so obviously the eternal suffering outweighs the potential for waste of time. But this argument, Pascal himself says this is not like a sort of rational conclusion. It's not a syllogism that sort of proceeds necessarily from premises to conclusion. It's a kind of, it's meant to sort of turn the infidel towards faith, and then it requires a development of habits. So it's only, he also famously says that you only acquire faith by sort of pretending to go along with it to start with, or by sort of accepting the outward signs of faith at first. So you can't sort of rationally convince yourself to believe in God, but what you can do is you can decide to go to church and go through the motions of prayer and so on. You can do all these things, and then faith sort of comes about through this practice of going through the motions that at first is kind of pretense. And so for Pascal, the conception of the individual is much more, it's something much more obscure than it is for Descartes, where the individual is something that sort of has this immediate intuitive self-knowledge. For Pascal, the individual has to sort of create itself and can only learn about itself sort of after the fact. It has to sort of go through an experience to come to have knowledge of itself. And then we turn to Spinoza, who is much more Cartesian than Pascal, but is also in many ways anti-Cartesian. So just in terms of biography, Spinoza wrote a book where he takes Descartes' principles of philosophy and puts it into a geometrical form. And there's a preface, which is written by one of Spinoza's students or disciples, who, but also approved by Spinoza, where he sort of distances himself from the content of the book. So he says, I'm just sort of setting out Descartes' positions, and I don't necessarily agree with everything in this book. But that's one of his first publications, is this book giving an exposition in geometrical form of Descartes' philosophy. And then his later work is sort of in the Cartesian tradition, but also critical of Descartes in many respects. But what one of the key differences, the one that Simondon picks up on, is how for Spinoza the human soul is a kind of spiritual automaton, as opposed to for Descartes the human soul is characterized by liberty, by free will. For Spinoza, the soul is a kind of automaton. So the various processes that occur in the human soul proceed with the same regularity and necessity as natural phenomena do. And so um, the understanding of the relationship between the soul and the body has to be um, much more complicated for Spinoza than it is for Descartes, who can just sort of appeal to the pineal gland as this kind of mysterious point of junction between the animal spirits and the soul that changes the direction of their motion. For Spinoza, there's a kind of correspondence without interaction between the ideas that make up the human soul and the parts of the human body. And so he wants to, in particular, he wants to look at the passions of the soul. So the various affections that the soul undergoes when the body is affected by external objects in various ways. And he wants to understand these passions so that we can have an understanding of how a human being can become free and not be subject to passions that are external effects from outside of the human being. And so this is sort of the progression of the ethics from the first book is about the nature of God, and then the intervening books are about the nature of the human passions, and then the last book is how human beings can become free from the passions in having this intellectual knowledge of God. Okay, so I think that's what we saw. Oh, and one last point is this sort of obscure concept that Spinoza introduces, the idea of an infinite mode. So um, a mode, every finite being is a mode. It's a property of the one substance. But there's also this infinite mode, which is what he calls the facies totius universi, the face of the whole universe. So there's this constant proportion of motion and rest in the whole universe, which makes up this sort of quasi-individual of which we are a part. And yeah, so there's these infinite modes, which are kind of an obscure point of Spinoza's theory, but that he holds are important parts of his account of individuation. Okay, so Angus has volunteered to read, so we're on page 580 of the PDF, starting from in this conception.
In this conception, there is a consequence to the Cartesian manner of contemplating extension. Bodies can only be distinguished from one another based on movement. Bodies are only distinct insofar as they are extended. However, the quantity of this movement is constant, and the laws of its communication or distribution are eternal truths. To the extent that what distinguishes bodies does not belong specifically to each body, the individuality of bodies cannot appear as a positive property. Here we find again this aspect of Cartesian physics that excludes all potential energy and conserves only actual energy in the form of quantity of movement. So the conservation of the quantity of movement due to the exchanges that occur between the different places of extension can only be affirmed for totality. In this physics, wherein what individualizes extension is the unique form of actual energy, no limited physical system can receive a veritable individuality. The same applies for Spinoza. With Spinoza, since the soul is the idea of the body, this weak consistency of corporeal individuality is also true for the individuality of the soul. With Descartes, on the contrary, all the aspects refused to extension were conserved in the soul thanks to the substantiality of the res cogitans. With Spinoza, man becomes spiritual automaton. This automaton that is the individual is an expression of divine capacity. This being, which tends to persevere in its being according to the conatus, has an immediate attachment to itself. In the body, this attachment is appetite, and in the soul, it is desire, cupiditas, the tendency to affirm oneself that exists in every idea, since the idea is self-position and not a silent painting on a canvas. Joy, sadness, love, hate, the passions originate in the encounter of exterior causes acting on our body and in the being's effort to preserve in being. to persevere in being. Certain aspects of the functioning of an automaton that have been studied recently are noted with a great amount of precision by Spinoza to explain the states of fluctuation that make us love and hate one and the same thing due to the sequence of the play of associations. Even the rapport between individuals can be explained according to a schema of automatism. Such is the case concerning the multiplication of hate. The whole course of nature determines the affections of the automaton that the human individual is. Nevertheless, the spiritual automaton can also seek freedom by escaping from the slavery of the passions. There are absolute ideas in the soul. We necessarily have an adequate idea of what is found both in the whole and the part. Since we have an idea of a mode of extension or a mode of thought, as mutilated and confused as it may be, we will necessarily have adequate ideas of the attribute thought and the attribute extension. We have an adequate idea of God, whose nature is fully present in each of his modes. These adequate ideas are common notions because they are equally implicated in every individual, and their ensemble constitutes reason. So when he talks about, you were talking about earlier, the spiritual automatism, is the idea here that because we can't have Cartesian substantiation, so we can't have the independence of thought from the body in the way that Descartes can. The soul becomes just as mechanical as things in extension are for Descartes.
Yeah, I think the direction is actually the other way around. I think it's so Spinoza in a few different places he says that what was sort of lacking in the ancients, and I think he's thinking primarily of Aristotle, is this notion of the soul as a spiritual automaton, and so I think that's the starting point, and it's from there that he
Interesting.
yeah. So he starts from the conception of the soul as a spiritual automaton, and it's from there that he proceeds to the denial of bisubstantiality. So it's maybe a different direction than contemporary readers might take, where we would start from the denial of bisubstantiality and then proceed to this notion of the soul as a spiritual automaton. But yeah, so it seems like Spinoza went the other direction. But yeah, so the idea is that all of like our soul, the human soul, consists of ideas of the various parts of the body. The body is composed of various smaller bodies, blood and bones, and all the different things that make up a human body. And the human soul is this very complex idea made up of all these component ideas, and the interaction of those ideas is just as mechanical as the interaction of the various parts of the body. So we deny anything like Cartesian free will a role in the formation of ideas and the interaction of ideas. But it's also very interesting that so he takes what in some respects is a kind of reductionist account of human cognition. So he reduces it to this mechanical interaction of the ideas, but at the same time he as opposed to someone like Hobbes, who has a similar kind of reduction of the soul to this mechanical interaction of ideas. On the contrary to Hobbes, Spinoza has a very strong sort of rationalist understanding of human knowledge. So this interaction of ideas is not sort of doesn't sort of decrease the capacity of human beings for knowledge. It's not that we have less capacity for knowledge than Descartes thought we did. We actually have more capacity for knowledge because we can have a clear and distinct understanding, or we can have an adequate idea of the nature of God, and we don't have this interaction between the soul and the body that Descartes already said was beyond human understanding. So on the one hand, Spinoza kind of reduces the operations of the human soul to this interaction of ideas through spiritual automatism, but at the same time, he expands the capacity of human knowledge to include the nature of God, which we have adequate knowledge of, and the whole universe essentially. There's nothing that we can't have adequate knowledge of if we apply ourselves correctly. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I don't know, 61, if you're back, if you're available to read. If not, I can read the next bit. Okay, I'll take that as a note. I'll let you read later on. Okay, so I'll read from here. Now, insofar as he has adequate ideas, the human individual, instead of being determined by the course of individual acts instead of being determined by the course of nature. The importance of the expression insofar as is paramount here. It signifies that man can pass from servitude to freedom if he is the adequate cause of his affections. Without ceasing to be an automaton, the spiritual automaton can persevere in its being without the aid of external causes. There can be a part of ourselves of which we are the adequate cause. The affection of desire then remains without passion. Only sadness, with all the affections that depend on it, can be nothing but passive, since a being of itself would not be able to tend toward its own destruction, and since by necessity it has an exterior cause. The virtuous action, that which most increases our own capacity, is one that is determined by adequate ideas or follows reason, for we are its adequate cause, and the action of which we are the cause is the most perfect of all. The Cartesian individual was composed of two substances. What is passion for one is action for the other, and vice versa. Conversely, according to Spinoza, the individual who possesses a correspondence instead of an interaction between the body and the soul has no need of Cartesian free will. Every passive affection can become virtue when inadequate knowledge is replaced with adequate knowledge. This is how ambition can become piety. To defeat a passion is not to struggle against it, but to know it, i.e., to grasp an adequate idea of the affection that it envelops. However, the affections born of adequate ideas have some singular chances of survival and constancy. If an affection is so strong that it is awakened by a greater number of causes, no affection will be stronger than one that is linked to adequate ideas, i.e., to ideas whose objects are constant and eternal. The idea that we have of our finite individuality as such is an inadequate idea. The idea that we have of God and of the principles of nature is an adequate idea. This idea transforms the one that we make of ourselves. We know ourselves as determined by the laws of the universe. In this sense, we lose nothing of what was positive in our own individuality. Far from suppressing the conatus through which we tend to persevere in our being, in some sense we rely on the conatus of the universe. Consequently, we connect to the universe, our individual qua part of the universe, based on what it has in common with all the other parts. But it is not our individual as such that we connect to the universe. On the knowledge of the second type is superposed the knowledge of the third type that intuitively grasps the necessary dependence connecting our individuality as such to the nature of God and his attributes. We then see our individual in what is singular about it ensue from the nature of God. This knowledge is eternal life, independent of all duration, while the knowledge of the first type made of man a finite and singular being. In the knowledge of the third type, man, on the contrary, is revealed as a singular but eternal being. Between the knowledge of the first type and that of the third is inserted the moment when man sees himself assimilated into universal necessity in the knowledge of the second type. It is in this sense that man has within himself a certain potential which, through knowledge, is likely to change level, point of application, and ultimately effect. Man's structure is not absolutely fixed. This solution to the problem of individuality is not without a certain analogy with that of Descartes, representing the rapports of the soul and the body through this relay that is the pineal gland. The soul changes the course of the animal spirits without adding to or taking away from their quantity of movement. Similarly, due to the fact that every idea contains an affirmation and isn't just a silent painting on a canvas, knowledge can modify the manner in which the conatus acts in the human individual. This conatus is always the same at the level of knowledge of the first, second, and third type, but its orientation is modified. And it can be said in a certain sense that the conatus orients itself because the conatus is not different from the idea's power of self-affirmation. It therefore must be said that the individual is an automaton in the highest sense of the term, since instead of being completely actual, the conatus can remain in reserve in a somewhat potential manner so as to be applied to itself. This return, in action returning to itself, is one of the distinctive signs of individuality, but it requires an addition to pure Cartesian mechanism of a certain potential dynamism incorporated in the conatus. Right, so here Simondon just sort of alludes to this doctrine of the three types of knowledge that Spinoza explains in the Ethics. So the three kinds of knowledge are, so the first kind of knowledge is knowledge from experience or hearsay. So the example Spinoza gives is with performing a mathematical calculation. It's finding the fourth proportional. So if you have A is to B as C is to D, and you're given A, B, and C, then you have to find D. And he says that there's a certain rule you can apply that you might have learned in school and just sort of memorized by rote. So it's just knowledge by hearsay. Or you might sort of try out on a couple of small numbers that are easy to calculate and sort of generalize to form a rule based on those few numbers that you've tried out. So those are both instances of the first kind of knowledge. And this kind of knowledge is characterized by the imagination. So it involves forming an image or an idea based on experience or hearsay. Then the second kind of knowledge is knowledge through demonstrations. These demonstrations are based on common notions. So there are certain properties of things that are common to all entities of a certain kind. So extension, for example, the various properties of extension are common to everything in the attribute of extension. And so geometrical knowledge, so we can demonstrate properties of triangles and rectangles and so on. And these properties will be true of anything that has extension in the appropriate figure. And so this kind of knowledge through demonstration is knowledge of the second kind. And then finally, the third kind of knowledge is much more obscure than the first two, but it's kind of intuitive knowledge. So in the case of the finding the fourth proportional, we have this sort of immediate grasp of the rule for what the fourth proportional is. So we don't need to sort of apply a rule that we learned in school. We don't demonstrate through proofs what the rule is, but we have this immediate intuitive grasp of how the fourth proportional relates to the three given terms. And our goal, or what the ethics leads up towards, is to have knowledge of this third kind of God and of how our soul relates to God. And so we have intellectual love of God through knowledge of the third kind. We have this immediate intuitive grasp of ourselves as a part of God, of the one substance, and it's through this intuitive knowledge of ourselves as a part of God that we overcome our affection by entities outside of us and overcome the passions in that sense. And the other bit that Simondon picks up on here is Spinoza's concept of conatus, which is this notion of the effort of an entity to persevere in its being. So everything that exists has this property of persevering in its being as much as possible. So an entity has a certain nature, a certain essence, and it tries, or it has this property of acting in such a way as to preserve that essence. So entities try to preserve themselves in sort of anthropomorphic terms, in terms of effort. But in the case of the human being has this conatus, this effort to preserve itself, but it can also sort of have this, I guess, recursive action on its own conatus through this intellectual knowledge of God. So by knowing ourselves as parts of the one substance, we sort of change what we are. We're no longer this finite, limited being that is trying to preserve itself against affections coming from outside. We are now a part of the universe as a whole, coming to know itself in this intuitive manner. And so we overcome the limitation of our finitude, of our separation, and we become part of something infinite. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. If someone else would like to read from this action of the individual.
I can read.
Ollie has volunteered.
Go ahead. I didn't see that.
Oh, Ollie, you're on mute. I don't know if you have started.
Oh, okay. Sorry and thank you. So this action of the individual, the Paul?
Yeah.
Okay. This action of the individual being upon himself through knowledge doesn't just begin at the level of the third type of knowledge. but instead at the moment when the individual begins to make use of the second type of knowledge and the common notions. To make use of reason is already to grasp things under a certain form of eternity. Sub quondam aeterni specie. Eternal life is a knowledge of ourselves sub specie aeternitatis. There is no passage from time to eternity. The conatus of desire or desire to know things by the third kind of knowledge cannot arise from the first kind of knowledge, but from the second. End of quote. Ethics 28, 320. Due to the second type of knowledge, the corporeal individual, both for Spinoza and for Descartes, is like a whole web of intelligible relations. Rational knowledge is a starting point wherein the soul must be immediately established, otherwise it will never happen. Spiritual life is not conceived as a return towards a lost primordial state, but as a methodical progress, passing from a perfect knowledge to another knowledge that is deduced from it. The common notions of reason are the source of deduction. Reason consists of this progress that advances towards singular things. The finite modes existing duration are not deduced from the absolute nature of the attributes of God. However, the fifth part of the ethics, deduction leads to these singular beings themselves, albeit endowed with a quite different type of existence and known subspacie eternitatis. The individual can be grasped in its eternal essence as a necessary consequence of this infinite mode of extension that the laws of movements are. If the soul is the idea of the body, it is therefore necessary, even if the actually existing body perishes, that something of it remains, something eternal, namely its essence, which follows eternally from the infinite intellect or the intellect of God, infinite mode of thought, just as its body follows the laws of movement in extension. Quote, Sentimus ex peri nos aeroton aeteronus esse. End of quote. We feel and we experience ourselves as eternal through these eyes of the soul that the demonstrations are. Such is the conception of the essentia particularis affirmativa in the fifth part of the ethics. Singular thing is affirmative when it has understood itself by saying in its very singularity its dependence on the universe. Determination, which is negation, is on the contrary the boundary of being that does not have its reason within itself. The conatus, which constitutes the being's essence, is pure affirmation that poses the being without any limit in duration. By passing from passive affections to active affections, originating with the infinite intellectual love that God has for himself, the conatus loses nothing but its limitations. At that point, the love and the soul experiences for God, and that joins with his essence, the God for its cause. This joy and this love no longer have anything passive about them, since the soul by nature is their adequate cause. There is consequently no longer opposition between the particular being and God or nature. The eternal life of the soul is like the internal development of this essence based on its principle. To know this essence is to better know this principle, just as we know geometrical being or the better as more consequences are deduced from its definition. Quote, the more we understand particular things, the more we understand God. End of quote. The individual's salvation, therefore, consists in the affection of joy and fortitude, which are linked to knowledge. But according to the theological, political treatise, other paths are possible, particularly the path of religious life. Faced with this diversity of human paths, the state should only protect the freedom of thinking without taking sides behind a given belief and without suppressing the individual natural right. The role of the state is to prevent what is negative and destructive in the conflict of the passions, It cannot produce the affections that unite men. It can only facilitate their development by protecting them from the passive passions that would destroy them. Consequently, individuals have the right to judge this state and to revolt if it uses violence or stirs up hate between subjects.
Right. Thanks.
That's it?
Yeah, you can stop here. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for reading those Latin passages as well.
Oh,
Right. So, there's a few points in this passage that are worth going over. So, one of the points of departure of Spinoza from Descartes is this notion of the starting point of knowledge. For Descartes, we have to have this sort of foundational structure of knowledge. We have to base all of our knowledge on something indubitable. Otherwise, it's all just sort of conjecture. It's not true knowledge. But for Spinoza, this whole sort of epistemological problem, he basically says, "I don't care about this." He in the short treatise, he gives this amazing phrase: "Habemus enum ideam veram," for we have a true idea. So he just sort of accepts at the outset that we have a true idea. This is something that we as human beings we have a true idea. We have knowledge, and we don't really need to worry about providing a foundation for knowledge in that sense. And so we're sort of already in knowledge at the outset. The human being is always already in the domain of knowledge, and it's not. There's no question of sort of setting out and trying to create knowledge from nothing, as there is with Descartes. But the knowledge that we have, we is sort of obscured by the imagination. So the body is affected by other bodies outside of itself, and the human soul is sort of in parallel with the body is affected by ideas of other bodies, and freedom consists in becoming the cause of one's own ideas, or the cause of one's own being, in a sense. So we in the case of inadequate knowledge, when we are affected by things outside of us, we are not the causes of our own ideas. The causes of our ideas are outside of us. But then when we have adequate knowledge, it's ourselves, it's our own soul that is the cause of our own knowledge. And this is what freedom consists in. So it's not a question of sort of escaping from the laws of nature or the universal determinism of nature. It's a question of where the causes of our ideas are located, either outside of us or within us. And in particular, we can start to have adequate ideas of things when we view them sub quadam aeterni specie, so under a certain kind of eternity. And so we conceive of things insofar as they follow from the idea of God. So everything has an essence that, or a particular nature that, in the case of bodies, consists of a certain proportion of movement and rest. But each of these natures or essences of entities follows from the idea of God. And insofar as we know an entity through this following from the idea of God, we know it as something eternal. So we don't. So the example that Spinoza uses to illustrate this notion is if we have the idea of a man, or of man as such, we understand the essence of man, but we don't necessarily know. We don't need to know, how many men there are in the world. So he gives an example. If there were 20 men, for example, we don't need to have knowledge in order to have knowledge of the essence of man. This knowledge of the essence wouldn't tell us why there are exactly 20 men and not 19 or 21 or 1,000 or whatever. We just have a knowledge of the essence of man, which follows eternally from the idea of God. We don't need to have knowledge of the production of each of these individual men who realizes this idea, this essence. And so by knowing things under the form of eternity, we have adequate ideas of them that don't depend on something outside of us. It depends only on the knowledge of God that we have within us. And then, in particular, once we have knowledge of ourselves in this under a certain form of eternity, once we know ourselves as following from the idea of God, it's not just like our knowledge of ourselves actually transforms ourselves. So the knower and what is known coincide in this case, and so coming to have this knowledge of ourselves in this way changes what we ourselves are. So we, as knowers under the form of eternity, come to be something eternal, something that exists as part of God and following from the idea of God. And so this is this again another sort of amazing phrase that Spinoza uses in the Ethics. He says, "Sentimos experimorque nos aeternos esse." We feel and we experience ourselves to be eternal. And this is something that Simon Dong has cited this phrase in Volume 1. We saw this when we read Volume 1, how we have this sense of ourselves as being eternal, as not subject to death, or we have the sense that there's something of us that remains after death. And for Spinoza, this is the ourselves insofar as we know ourselves to be follow from the idea of God. So insofar as we have this knowledge of ourselves under the form of eternity, that ourselves in that respect are eternal, are not subject to generation and destruction, and so this is something that does not disappear with death. So the more our soul is occupied with this eternal, with knowledge of the third kind and this eternal knowledge, the more our soul is something that is not destroyed by death. And so this is what human salvation consists in, is this capacity for the soul to become something that does not disappear with death through this knowledge of the third kind.
I think it's kind of a very simplified version of understanding of Spinozian philosophy, because in ethics there are bunch of ideas Spinoza thought of human beings, and then the relation human beings and God and the nature and so on. What I want to ask is like Simon Dong seems really focus on the how individual has a relations with the God, or the kind of exterior kind of environments, like what milieu what the Simon Dong refers to the milieu. But what I want to ask here is like how an individual get to the fortitude, or like the eternal state, like kind of like what is the exact meaning nature of adequate idea here? Because in a way, Spinoza, I don't know, Simon don't understand that Spinoza wants to respect the individuality, singularity, and then by extension, that can be part of the God. As far as I understand, which means like it respects like individual singularity, but at the same time, Spinoza also wants to individual human beings like to follow the I mean the part of the word of God, like the nature, which is called like adequate ideas. But here, what does it mean by the adequate ideas? To what extent we can, I mean, individuals can, um, like have the singular ideas versus like the thought of God. I mean, the so-called adequate ideas. My question is kind of like a messy. Like, is that clear?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're asking about. So adequate ideas. Yeah, this is a bit of a difficult point in Spinoza because he wants to distinguish his theory of adequate ideas from a sort of straightforward correspondence theory of truth. So it's not that he sort of rejects the correspondence theory of truth, but he thinks that this is sort of an external characterization of what it means for something to be true. So if you think of correspondence, so our idea of something sort of matches the thing that it's the idea of. So if we have an idea of the sun, for example, that idea will be a correct idea, will correspond to the sun if that idea depicts the sun in the way that the sun really is. And this, for Spinoza, this is a sort of external characterization of the truth of an idea, and it's Spinoza wants to sort of overcome this external notion of the correctness of an idea, and he wants to see the adequacy of ideas as something internal to the idea. So it's part of the idea itself. The adequacy of the idea is something that is internal to the idea. So our idea of the sun is adequate if it has sort of in itself we can sort of contemplate this idea and have knowledge of the sun through this idea without having to sort of compare the idea to the external entity. So this is sort of Spinoza's, I guess, program of what he wants the adequacy of ideas to consist in, but it's somewhat obscure how exactly we're meant to understand this adequacy because so what it means exactly to have an adequate idea of the sun, for example, is we are not supposed to compare our idea with the sun as something outside of our idea. We're supposed to just sort of proceed from the idea of the sun itself, and that idea has certain marks or characteristics of truth sort of inherent in it. And so we have to be able to sort of determine from examining an idea whether it's an adequate idea or not. And this is sort of a difficult point of how exactly we're meant to do this. It's not 100% clear in Spinoza. But what he does tell us about adequate ideas is that we have adequate ideas of the common notions are adequate ideas. So everything that follows from an attribute is a common notion. So everything that follows from the concept of extension is a common notion, and so all the geometrical properties of bodies are adequate ideas, and likewise everything that follows from the attribute of thought is an adequate idea. But it's only so through the common notions we have knowledge that we can bring about deductive knowledge. So we form an adequate idea of a sphere, for example, and then we can deduce various properties of the sphere through reasoning. And so this is one form of adequate knowledge. And this is the second form of knowledge. And this form sort of leaves us with the desire for the third form of knowledge, the intuitive grasp of the essences of things. And so it's this third form of knowledge that is sort of the fully adequate idea, the adequate idea in the full sense of the term. It's in this third kind of knowledge that we have a knowledge of ourselves as parts of God, parts of the one substance, and as therefore as eternal entities and not subject to destruction by death. So this is sort of an instance of how human beings have eternal ideas, but the sort of mechanism of the adequate ideas, of how we recognize an adequate idea, is something that he leaves somewhat obscure.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your explanation. In a way, it was quite interesting, like how Simondon understands like Spinoza, like pick the specific part and make use of it for his own philosophy. And then the Spinozian ideas are quite revolutionary, like thinking of his considering his time. But regarding like adequacy of the ideas, like common notions, everything is really important to kind of a concept. But in a way, he couldn't get out of like a poorly like out of the frame of religion at the end of the day, because like the thinking. I mean, pursuing like a fortitude and then like the adequate ideas, all things together. As you said, it's kind of obscure at the end of the day, and then he goes back to it at the end of the day, like to the frame of religion at the end of the day, like as it is stated in the passage I've read.
Yeah, the notion of religion in Spinoza is a difficult one because so just as a sort of biographical note, so Spinoza was from a Portuguese Jewish family, but he was born in the Netherlands because his family was expelled from Portugal, um, and he in the 1650s, I believe, was expelled from the Jewish community of Amsterdam. And it's not 100% clear what exactly his sort of crime was, but he um, was sort of teaching or publicizing ideas that the leaders of the Jewish community considered heretical. And later in his life, he was associated with some uh, sort of heterodox Christian communities, Quakers, I believe, and some others. And he so he writes the theological political treatise. He publishes this anonymously, um, and this book is, as you said, is a kind of revolutionary book. It's one of the first books that tries to do a kind of historical analysis of scripture of the biblical texts, and so Spinoza argues that he particularly is opposed to rabbinical interpretations of the biblical text, so the interpretations that rabbis had proposed of the biblical texts. And these interpretations often tried to sort of reconcile different passages of the text that seem to be contradictory. So you have like stories about like in a particular year, this person was so many years old, and then you have like later in the story, 5 years later, he's 10 years older or something like that. It you have these texts where there seems to be a contradiction between two different passages, and often in these cases, the rabbis would give some interpretation of why the text seems to be contradictory, but in fact is not. And Spinoza is very critical of this kind of interpretation, and he argues that we have to sort of stick to what the text says. And in particular, he argues that the teaching of the Bible is only an ethical teaching. It only the true content of the biblical text is the injunction to love your neighbor as yourself, and all of the sort of metaphysical and cosmological and other conceptions that the authors of the biblical text might have had about how the world was created in the book of Genesis, for example. All of that is just sort of incidental and is not important to the sort of spiritual status of these texts. And so this text, of course, aroused a lot of opposition, and he was identified pretty quickly, even though it was published anonymously. But yeah, so in this text, Spinoza argues in a kind of religious framework. So he's arguing about the what's important about the biblical texts and what lessons we should draw from it and what aspects are sort of relevant to our contemporary life. And he gives a sort of positive role to religion. He kind of identifies religion with understanding of the nature of God as as manifested through loving one's neighbor as oneself. But what exactly he means by religion is not. It's obviously not sort of belonging to a synagogue or a church as they existed in his own time. He sees religion as something that involves a kind of self understanding of the world, I guess we could say. So it's through religion that the universe or nature comes to understand itself. It's kind of creating an image of itself through religion, and what religion consists in primarily for us, for human beings, is what he calls obedience, or in general, it's this loving one's neighbor as oneself. So um, there's a very subtle relationship between the life of reason as it's set out in the ethics and religion as it's set out in the theological political treatise, because he argues that not everyone is capable of living in accordance with reason, um, and having this intellectual love of God and knowledge of the third kind and so on. But what religion does by teaching religion, it allows other people to sort of live uh, in a kind of community with each other. It allows people to overcome their passions that lead to conflict with each other, and to um, actually increase each other's power of acting. So by living with others in the form of religion, by having this religious form of community, our capacity for action is increased. We become more powerful than we were on our own. So this, yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot to say about like what exactly Spinoza means by religion, and it's more than just what Simondon sort of alludes to here. But it has a very subtle interaction with the life of reason, as Spinoza puts it out in the Ethics.
Oh, very, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's the Theological Political Treatise is a really amazing book, because it's like a little bit about the political context of this book is that there was a conflict at the time in the late 17th century between the sort of Republican tradition or party within the Netherlands. So the side that wanted to maintain the Netherlands as a republic, and then there was a monarchist party that wanted to have a kingdom in the Netherlands. And the monarchists were associated with the sort of fundamentalist Calvinist party, which wanted to impose Calvinism as the state religion and end the religious toleration um, that sort of prevailed in the Netherlands at the time. And so this conflict was one of the sort of was part of the context in which Spinoza is writing, and he sort of intervenes in this debate between the sort of liberal Republicans and the fundamentalist Calvinists by sort of trying to sort of meet the Calvinists on their own ground, or show, like, refute them on their own basis. So he argues from the biblical text that ultimately the state has to sort of respect freedom of thought, and can't impose a state religion, or shouldn't impose a state religion in the way that the Calvinists wanted it to. And so it's a very subtle text to sort of decipher, like, how much of it is Spinoza's own his own thinking versus how much is sort of a tactical move that he's making in this debate between the fundamentalists and the Republicans. So it's a fascinating text, and it's very important for the history of biblical interpretation as well, because he's one of the first people to try to analyze the biblical text as a kind of historical document. It's one that is written in a particular historical context, in various time periods. It's not sort of this kind of eternal divine revelation in the sense that other authors had taken it to be. It's something that appears in a particular social context, and in a particular time and place. So yeah, that's sort of my pitch to read the Theological Political Treatise.
Yeah, I think I should read it one day. Can I just like a simple one more question, if time allows?
Yeah, sure.
The as far as I understand, like Spinoza is trying to like the overcome not to try to stick to the transcendental morality, like of, if I say like a Kantian kind of morality, instead of like he tried to ask people to to have some kind of their own ethics, like which is not against like the God or nature, like which would be like good for seeking for the beatitude, the state of the state of kind of like the good state, whatever. By which is not against like one's joy, one's like happiness, something like that. So kind of like respecting again like one's singularity, individuality, and that could be composed of like the community. I mean the happiness of the community, and then the word of God or whatever, something like that. So it's more like not the top down but the bottom up kind of ethics. Can I understand that way? Like as Simongdong would understand that way too.
Yeah, the Spinoza's ethics, like his sort of ethical principles, again are sort of subtle because on the one hand he's a kind of naturalist in terms of ethics, so he denies any kind of sort of supernatural principle of the good or anything like that, and he argues against the validity of concepts like perfection or beauty or goodness. There's no such thing in the world as something more perfect or less perfect. It's just how entities are sort of useful or not for us that makes us call them perfect or imperfect. So on the one hand, he has this kind of naturalism that treats these sort of value judgments as being relative to human interests. But then on the other hand, he also has this conception of he argues that what what most sort of accords with the human essence is other human beings. So what promotes our power of acting, what makes us more capable of acting, is community with other human beings, and so he talks about intellectual community. So our knowledge of the world and of our relationship to God is sort of promoted by having an intellectual community with others. Other people can teach us things we learn through reading, and we, in particular, through the freedom of the press, which he also advocated in the Theological Political Treatise. We allow for the sort of free development of intellectual community, and so his sort of understanding of ethics has to do with what promotes the capacity for action. So something is good insofar as it increases the human capacity for action, and it's bad if it reduces that capacity for action. And so ultimately, it's community, and then the knowledge of God. These two things together, or they're ultimately sort of one thing, because it's through community that we sort of achieve the intellectual love of God. It's through community that we increase our power of acting, and so ultimately this sort of naturalistic approach to value judgments leads to an ethics of communal promotion of the capacity for action. And so it's by living with others in such a way as to help each other have a greater capacity for action, that we ourselves can increase our own capacity for action. So yeah, it's a very subtle kind of approach to ethical principles that I think has probably not been taken up as much as it would be worth doing.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Unless there are any other comments or questions, I'm going to suggest that we end here for today and then start the Malebranche section next time, if that's okay with everyone.
That sounds good.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, great. So thank you everyone for coming out, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you. See you
Thanks,
next
John.
week.
Thanks, everyone.